guys, and welcome back to Contract B. This is video 2 for topic 6, which is discharge by performance and agreement. We've just had a look in video 1 at dependent and independent obligations, and now we are going to look at the issue of entire and divisible contracts, or entire and divisible obligations. And here we are back at our Prezi, and we need to look at this issue. So before we work out whether or not the purchase price can be claimed from the other party, we have to sort out whether or not we have this issue of entire or divisible contracts or obligations. And in terms of entire contracts, or a part of a contract, an obligation in a contract is entire, you will only be able to claim the contract price if exact performance of the whole contract or that divisible part has been performed. Okay, there has to be complete, exact performance precisely as the contractual terms stipulate. This is a condition precedent to the payment of price. So the obligation to pay will never crystallize in an entire contract unless and until the other party has performed precisely according to the contractual terms. Really strict, really exact, okay? The benefit, so they say when they're rationalising this form of contract, the benefit expected by the defendant is the enjoyment of, as you can see there, every part of the work jointly. Now, unless and until all of those parts have been delivered up and performed, then the other party is not going to get their benefit, and they're not going to have to pay. And here we have the rather awful case of Cutter and Powell, and I think this is probably another one of your more memorable cases for Contract B. Certainly kind of stuck in my mind for about 20 years. And here we had Mr. Cutter, who had agreed to perform services as a seaman on board a vessel headed from Jamaica to Liverpool. So as you can imagine, this is quite a dated case, 1795, but the principle still holds true so far as entire contracts are concerned. And pretty much courts have been trying to step around this case ever since 1795, but we'll get to that in a minute. Mr. Cutter was to be this seaman on this journey. 2-month journey it was, and he died 6 weeks into the journey. The ship came back to Liverpool, and there were questions in relation to his estate, and his estate claimed to be paid from the master of the ship his proportionate pay 6 weeks out of the 2 months. And the question there was, is this an entire contract, or in fact is it divisible? Can he be paid a proportionate amount of the wages that he would have got if he completed the entire journey? And the court actually said, no, this is an entire contract. He had to perform all of his duties exactly as stipulated by the contract before his right to be paid crystallised. So his estate could not claim that proportionate amount out of his contract. Now, the thing I think that the court really laid a lot of emphasis on was the fact that Cutter was to be paid about 4 times the usual rate for that kind of journey than would otherwise have been the case. And they said, look, really, this was the deal. He had to perform everything exactly. If he did, he would get this enormous pay. If not, then he was not entitled to anything. And so the contract was declared entire, and there had been no complete exact performance, and there was to be no payment made to the estate. So that is the very unfortunate case of Cutter and Powell. So if you don't have an entire contract, what might you have? You will have a contract that can be carved into parts. Now, each of those parts will still require exact performance. If you want to talk about it in entire terms, each part of your divisible contract will need to be performed entirely, exactly, before payment is due for that part. Okay, so something a little more friendly than an entire contract, but I guess divided into chunks, which might allow the plaintiff to claim for a chunk that has been entirely performed. So the example that the text provides is that there's a contract for sale of goods, 1,000 carburetors, $10 each, 350 by 30 June, 350 by 30 August, and another 300 by the 30th of September. So you can easily say that there's a calculable amount payable for each chunk of the contract. So if they go ahead and deliver 350 on the 30th of June, being their contractual right to be paid for that chunk of the contract crystallises. Then being as soon as they've delivered their 350 on the 30th of August, their right to be paid for that delivery crystallises. So each part of a divisible contract has to be completely performed. It's like a little mini entire contract. Okay, now if that part has been done, then you need to be paid for that part. Okay, and each successive part will build on the other until you get to the whole of the contract price. Okay, so here we have the case of Steele and Tardiani, and in this case, it was a wartime case, 1946. You had some released prisoners that were milling some firewood for a property owner, and they obviously didn't take very much care with what they were doing, because the court found that the vast bulk of the firewood that had been milled was not actually cut according to the stipulations, which were 6 foot long and about 6 inches wide. So you can imagine what the argument was. The property owner tried to say, look, this was an entire contract unless and until all of the firewood was milled according to the stipulations, 6 foot long, 6 foot wide, then I don't get to enjoy any of it, and therefore I shouldn't have to pay for any of it. You can see the problem there. The court's saying, well, you've stipulated a rate per piece that had been correctly cut. So the contract was infinitely divisible, they said. All you have to do is work out the firewood that had been milled correctly, and the rate is going to apply for that. And you will have to pay for that, because for each divisible part of the contract that had been performed correctly, each log of wood that had been milled correctly, there was a rate applicable to that. So for each of those, you had to pay. And then the rest fell outside of the contract terms, and you couldn't say that they were exactly performed. You couldn't say that the milling had been exactly performed as stipulated. Now, then the question obviously is, what happens to all of the firewood that had not been milled correctly? And what you need to consider there is something like a quantum meruit, and we'll be talking about that later on. So just place a little bookmark there, and we'll finish that up in just a moment. So that's divisible contracts. Then we have this potential lump sum issue. The text writes this off as a bit of a furphy. I actually don't think it is a furphy. So you've got your entire contract. You know, if everything isn't done correctly, then you're not going to get paid any of the contract price. Sorry, my child just had a sneezing fit. Then you have your divisible contracts. And so if your contract can be divvied up into little sectionable parts, and each of those parts had been performed entirely, correctly, exactly, completely, you can get payment for those. But what happens where you've got a contract that kind of looks like an entire contract because you've got some specific work being done for a set price, but there's no indication that it's intended to be an entire contract? There's nothing in the contract that says that complete and exact performance is required as a condition precedent before the obligation to pay will crystallise. Obviously, that's a hallmark of an entire contract. What happens then? And Lord Denning in Hennig and Isaacs said, well, you know, it doesn't have to be an entire or a divisible contract. There is this other kind of contract. And commentators after Hennig and Isaacs have kind of dubbed this the lump sum contract. Kind of looks like an entire contract, but it's not specified to be entire. And in those situations, Obviously, the court can dance around that kind of Cutter and Powell problem and proceed to give some kind of relief to the party that has provided some performance. So that is the issue of a lump sum contract. Have a look at the text, have a look at their discussion, see what you think. Okay, I'll leave it up to you as to what you think there. And then we come to the issue of substantial performance. And we have to think about substantial performance where there has been something less than exact performance. Now, obviously, you don't have to worry about substantial performance and the doctrine of substantial performance if the contract is an entire one, because obviously, you're going to have complete and exact performance. Anything less is not going to merit any payment. Similarly, if the obligation to pay is independent, you don't have to worry about whether or not performance was rendered, because the obligation to pay simply crops up as and when the contract says it's going to crop up. So you don't have to worry about this whole doctrine in those two scenarios. If those two scenarios don't apply, then the plaintiff may be able to get paid for something less than stellar, exact, complete, precise, beautiful performance. Okay, and let's face it, we're all human, and this is obviously why this doctrine has evolved. So what's this doctrine all about? Denning and Heaney and Isaacs is probably the salient decision to take a look at here. And you can see why he found this kind of third classification of contracts. They're not entire, they're not divisible, there's something else here. And you can see that this one kind of looked like an entire contract because it was something that had to be done in return for a price to be paid. So we had the renovation and furnishing of a flat in return for £750. Okay, that sounds fair enough, but there was nothing in there to indicate that this was an entire contract. No, you must complete everything exactly according to the terms as a condition precedent for payment. No, there was none of that. The payment was said to be net cash as the work proceeds and the balance on completion. Work started, went along quite happily, about £400 odd was paid. Then it was found on completion we had the door of a wardrobe had to be replaced and there were some problems with a bookshelf. Now, the cost of fixing all that up was only about £55 odd. Now, the question was, did the defendant have to pay, or could the plaintiff say, well, you know what, I've done substantially everything that you've required, please pay me the balance of the purchase price. And in fact, that's what the court did, but they didn't let him get away with his shoddy workmanship. No, they said, you will get, to the defendant, you will get a set-off, that is the ability to retain that £55 odd that it's going to cost you to fix up the job. So the whole of the contract price was paid, less that amount for fixing up the shoddy workmanship. Fair enough too. So that's substantial performance there. When is the doctrine of substantial performance not going to get you any payment where you've rendered less than exact performance? Well, this one's pretty clear. Bolton and Mardiva. Here we had the agreement to install a water heating system for £560. So again, could otherwise look like an entire agreement, but there was no indicia that it was an entire agreement. Everything's installed, but there was a fair amount of shoddy workmanship in that particular case. You had fumes that emitted into the living areas of the home when this heating system was turned on, and you also had the rather problematic defect that the heating just didn't work, or didn't work properly. Now, Cairns had a look at the nature of the defects here. In that particular case, you can see that it was going to cost about £174 out of that £560 to fix the thing up. So about 30 odd % of the purchase price, again, on top of things to get things working as it should have been in the first place. Now, the doctrine of substantial performance is not going to save you in those kinds of circumstances. So there's your two ends of the spectrum, if you will. There's your two very clear rules of thumb. If your defect is going to be fairly minor, like in Heaney and Isaacs, rectification costs less than or about 10% odd, you're probably going to get your contract price and maybe a set off for what it's going to cost to rectify the defects. At the other end of the spectrum, at the Bolton and Mardiva end, if the defect's major and the rectification costs are around that 30 odd magical 1/3%, then you're probably not going to make it and you won't get your purchase price there under the doctrine of substantial performance. Then you get kind of all the grey area in between. So if the defect is minor, but the rectification costs are going to be more than 10%, you may get recovery if those rectification costs aren't going to spiral out of the realms of reasonableness. If the defect is major, but the cost of rectification is fairly small, it's probably going to depend on whether or not you could terminate for that defect. If you can, then even if the cost is going to be fairly small to rectify things, the court probably won't allow you to apply the doctrine of substantial performance to claim the contract price. So that is the doctrine of substantial performance. If you can't argue, it's kind of going downhill as we go, if you can't argue that you have in fact substantially performed, but you've only partly performed. So here, if the work is of no value to the defendant who's supposed to be paying for this thing, or the work is entirely different from what you were supposed to have done, or if you've actually gone ahead and repudiated or abandoned the contract, then generally speaking, you're not going to be looking at getting any part of the contract price there. So in Connor and Stainton, we had this classic case of a contract stipulating that it was for construction of a fence. The posts were meant to be about 12 feet apart. The plaintiff put them anywhere between 12 and 18 feet apart. So you've got kind of this really long area between the posts and the fence is kind of sagging. The plaintiff says, look, you can put in a star dropper, where it's starting to sag, put them in, it's all fixed up. The court said no substantial performance there. The fence posts being somewhere between 12 and 18 feet apart was entirely different as to what was asked for, so there was no recovery of any money there. Just a little kind of entertaining case to show you where the doctrine of substantial performance will end. But if all of that doesn't work and you have actually, you've done something that the other side would find of value, then you may be able to claim it in damages, and we'll look at that in week 9, or you might be able to make a claim of quantum meruit. And the claim of quantum meruit is kind of an interesting little beastie, part of the area of contract law we call restitution. You can claim on a quantum meruit even if you are in breach, which is rather interesting. But let's have a look at quantum meruit. So for quantum meruit, you are looking at an action for the reasonable value of the services performed. Quantum meruit is just simply Latin for the amount earned. So please pay me what I am due. I may not have given complete performance, nor even substantial, but I've done something, so you need to pay me for that. For claiming quantum meruit, you can only make it if there is no effective and binding contract on foot between the parties. So it's really only available in those limited circumstances where the contract has become at an end. Termination, rescission, frustration we'll have a little look at in week 8, where the contract is unenforceable or void. As I said, it's a restitutionary claim, so it will have the 3 usual elements required in a restitutionary claim: benefit, expense, and unjustness. Okay, the plaintiff has to have provided a benefit to the other party, it has to have come at their expense, and it would be unjust for the other side to keep that benefit without paying at least something for it. So if you are the party that's not in breach, if you've done everything you're supposed to do, then what you're going to be claiming is the whole contract price. So, a claim on a quantum meruit's not going to do you any good there. But if you have done less than full performance, and yet you're not in breach, you can choose between damages and a quantum meruit claim. The big difference is damages you can choose if the contract is continuing on, but for a quantum meruit, like I said, that contract actually has to have been terminated or otherwise have come to an end. So there's your big distinction there between damages and a quantum meruit claim. If you choose a quantum meruit claim, the big thing that the court will be looking for, as I said in terms of those three restitutionary elements, is that you have provided a benefit and that benefit has come at your expense, and obviously it's going to be unjust for the other side to keep it without paying something. So the analysis tends to often turn on this issue of providing a benefit, and the court takes an objective view of things. And they say, well, if the defendant asked for this work, then you can safely assume that they got a benefit out of what was done, even if it was less than full performance, exact performance, and something should be paid for it. Certainly, if the conduct of the defendant stops you from fully performing and then being able to go on and claim the full contract price, then the court will generally say, well, to the defendant, you can't deny that the services that had been performed before you stopped them performing the rest were of some benefit to you. Now, if you are the party in breach, obviously you're going to have more trouble convincing a court that you should be paid here. Particularly, as I said, we're going down a fairly sliding scale here. You obviously haven't done substantial performance. The contract's somehow come to an end and you've done something, you want to be paid, but you're in breach. You're still going to have to prove that the other party is going to get some kind of benefit out of all of this. The big difficulty here is if you're the party in breach, usually what has happened is that you've done something wrong so far as your performance is concerned. And the other party that's meant to be paying is probably going to turn around and say, I didn't want these services. Well, certainly not in the fashion that you have provided them. And therefore, I'm not going to receive a benefit. I shouldn't have to pay, not even on the quantum meruit. That's your major problem. So services are only going to be a benefit if they were actually requested by the other party, or if the work was freely accepted by the other party, or if they got some kind of incontrovertible benefit from the services. In those kind of limited scenarios, then even if you're in breach, you can claim on a quantum meruit. One of the big issues that you'll find a court wrestling over in terms of trying to find out whether the defendant actually did get a benefit or not from the performance that was rendered is that they will look at the issue of, well, okay, what they got, was it a benefit that was freely accepted? Okay, if it was freely accepted, then there's going to be more of an argument that some money should be paid for it, even if the other party is in breach. The issue with land contracts and building contracts is that there's usually, if someone's contracted to put a building on your property, there's not going to be an issue. You can't say, well, if the person does part of the building and then walks off the job, why should they be paid for the part that they've done? Because I can't really be said that it's a benefit I've freely accepted. I've got this half-formed building on my land. What am I going to do? Am I going to knock the whole thing down, get rid of it, and then tender out the work to someone else? I mean, that's really just not practical. And that's exactly what happened in Sumter and Hedges. You had a contract that was to build 2 buildings and a stable on some land. And it was about 500 odd pounds worth of a contract. There was about 300 odd pounds worth that was paid over, and the building had obviously commenced, and then the builder just walked off the job. And the builder then says, pay me something for what I've done. And the argument back on the defendant's side was, hang on a minute, I can't be said to have obtained this benefit by free acceptance. I've got something here on my land, I've got it, what am I going to do? Well, the court said, you're going to do exactly what you did do, which was you're going to use the building materials that were left on site by the builder, and you're probably going to finish the job yourself. There's no real choice about it. So in that kind of circumstance, then it's very unlikely you're going to succeed in a quantum meruit claim. We do a case in week 8 where we're looking at frustration. And there we have a rather interesting case called Cadelpha Constructions. We had a contract that was frustrated. So there in Sumter and Hedges it was abandoned. In fact, the builder just abandoned the contract and therefore it came to an end, and therefore there was that claim for quantum meruit. In Cadelpha we had the New South Wales State Government tendering for construction of a tunnel which was obviously involved a lot of blasting work, and the nearby neighbours were, jolly annoyed that this blasting work was continuing day and night. And they ultimately won an injunction against the construction mob. Now, it went all the way up to the High Court. The contract had in fact been frustrated. They were claiming on a quantum meruit. Obviously, they couldn't do the work without infringing, breaching the injunction. So they said, can we please be paid for the work that we've done? And the court said, yes, in fact, where the contract had been frustrated, you have done some work there, you can be paid on a quantum meruit. So they didn't use the Sumter and Hedges kind of scenario in that situation. Just a little interesting footnote to a couple of weeks' time when we look at Cadelpha. And of course, there's one last little case I should mention, which was one of the cases I mentioned right at the beginning of part 1 video, and that was Steele and Tardiani, the wood milling case. Now, in terms of free acceptance, all of the wood that had not been milled to those specifications of about 6 foot long, about 6 inches wide, obviously they didn't meet the contractual stipulations. However, what the owner of the property had done is he had actually accepted that firewood and he'd sold it off. So there, obviously, you'd had free acceptance of the benefit that had been provided, and the released Italian workers were able to be paid a quantum meruit for the wood that did not match specifications. So that is the claim for quantum meruit, and that is discharge by performance. So that is the end of part 2 for this week, and we'll go now to part 3 and we'll have a look at discharge by agreement. So I'll see you in part 3.